This is an interesting one. I have Maureen Cassidy here, a city councillor. But Maureen, we have a guest who's with you. Who is it?
It's Stella.
Stella.
And it's how I can control her is if I keep her close by. She thinks she's my guard dog.
I see. So can you keep her close by for half an hour, or is that too much?
No, she'll be happy with that.
That's good. Well, listen, I very much appreciate you doing this, Maureen. And I was just thinking as we were coming into this, you and I have at least three things in common. But the three that first came to my mind was politics. You're a city councillor, but I used to be involved at the federal level. So we both have some knowledge of that. The second is the mayor's panel. You were, that was about, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago. You were the deputy chair of that, along with Chris Mackey from the health unit. And we had help from city staff and others. And that was a 7-month, pretty intensive exercise, right? Where we talked with a lot of people, a lot of good experienced people, so on and so forth. That was quite the experience. And then finally, I think it's just the interest in poverty, period. I mean, whenever I see you and we talk, we always end up navigating to that subject because we're both quite passionate about it. So so we have that in common along with other things, but I did want to talk to you a bit about, maybe we'll follow those three things. But you're a city councillor. How have you found that during COVID?
Well, it's interesting. It has been interesting as the life that I knew as a councillor sort of got smaller. The life of a councillor is a lot about meetings, the official formal meetings in council chambers, but then there are a lot of the informal meetings. I get contacted really regularly by people wanting to meet to talk to me about the different issues that are taking place in the city. And then the big public events as well. We get invited to a lot of those. So those informal things shrunk down to almost nothing. And then the way that the public meetings were conducted also changed drastically into this virtual setting. So you would think that I would have had 2 years of a lot of extra time on my hands. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, because I sit on the Board of Health. I also sit on the Police Service Board. I was the chair of the Board of Health for the 2 first years of the pandemic. So I did find my life got very, very busy, but in a different kind of busy from what it had been before. Yeah.
So you were kind of Zoomed to death? Is that kind of what it was like?
Oh yeah, lots and lots of virtual meetings. And I find chairing a virtual meeting is much harder work than chairing a physical meeting where everybody's in person. Yeah. Board of Health, we didn't necessarily run into that issue of that disconnect from the human side of things. But I have found on city council that kind of disconnection, and people have talked about this council being a divided council. And I do believe that COVID played a huge role in that, because we spend a lot of time between meetings or in our breaks and all of that, being together as humans. We have meals together, we have coffee together, we pass each other in the hall and we ask about our kids. None of that happened for 2 years. So I think that leads to that divided kind of nature that it's sort of been experienced on this council.
Yep, we had a board meeting for the food bank last night. We were talking about the exact same thing. We haven't been able to meet. So you can't, a lot of that personality stuff that's so necessary to make an organization run, it's been far more difficult because of that. With COVID and going on, it just seems to me a whole bunch of social situations all kind of descended on council and the community at the same time. Things about housing or homelessness or food insecurity. Just so many of those kind of things all seem to happen all at once. And I know that COVID is a big reason for that, about the supply chain issues and intergovernmental workings, so on and so forth. But has it been your sense that the poverty situation itself, I'm not talking about any one particular aspect of it, but it's taken on more of a prominence for city council as a result of COVID?
The interesting thing is just before So we knew about COVID. We started hearing about it in December of 2019. It really hit us here about mid-March, which is when the state of emergency was declared and all of those things, lockdowns began. But we had just finished the 4-year budget, and we had just injected, I think, the largest investment into housing and homelessness prevention measures that ever for the City of London. So we already had quite a large base budget for housing and homelessness issues, and we put in, I believe it was 63 million additional dollars. These had been the way that the city staff present the budget. They have the base budget, and then they have things for council to consider. Some of them are recommended by staff. Some of them are council can consider these things, but we're not necessarily recommending them. There were housing and homelessness prevention items on both of those lists. I think City Council approved all of them. If not all of them, most of them. And that's the first time that's ever happened on this council. I actually did early in the pandemic, I gave a talk that was supposed to be at the Grand Theater. It ended up being virtual, and it was a city symposium talk. Have you heard of those talks?
Sure,
They have, yeah. So they invite 4 speakers, a public servant, an academic, an advocate, and I can't remember the 4th. And I was the public servant, and I spoke about the budget, and I spoke about, in hindsight, thinking how strange it was that we hadn't passed that kind of budget in the previous term of council, which arguably was more of a progressive council with more of those progressive types on the council. My conclusion was 2 things. Number one, as you know, as a politician, you deal with the budget that the staff bring to you. We don't build the budget from scratch. Staff put the budget together and table it, and then we talk about it. The second thing was that idea, because this was about gender equity, this talk, the number of public servants on city staff during the intervening years between the first term of council and the first 4-year budget and the second 4-year budget, I think we had almost the increase in women in the top leadership roles at City Hall had gone from, I think, 3 out of 11 to, I think, 6 out of 10. So I saw that as being a really important part of why the budget was the way it was. We talk about gender all the time and equity and those kinds of things. And I always cringe when people imply that women are better humans than men. Well, women will make these kinds of decisions and better decisions. I think women bring a different perspective and absolutely do talk about those social issues. I would say women leaders on average more than men, or in a different way than men. And I think some of it is because women tend to be mothers, not always, but women are mothers, men are not. And as mothers, we take the primary role still, although it is getting more equal, but generally the caregiving role is primarily on the mother. And so I think that brings a different perspective and brings a certain amount of empathy and recognition of the need to tackle those issues and see them as society-wide issues. And as we discussed with the poverty panel, we recognize that poverty is a community issue. It is not an issue for only the people that are suffering in poverty. It is an issue for every single one of us, and it affects every single one of us.
Do you think part of the reason why that budget, the 60-something million budget that you were talking about, how much of that do you think was the breaking of the ground prior to that? So I think of the mayor's panel, for instance, that you were co-chair of, and you did such a great job on that at bringing us all together to look at this more as a kaleidoscopic issue than a telescopic issue, right? Where we weren't focusing on one thing. There were all of these moving parts going on all at the same time. That was a 7-month exercise. I remember it was pretty intensive for us all. And we got city council approval in the end. And then I know then from that point on, it went on to the United Way, who then took it from there for the next 2 or 3 years to try to further address and promote many of the issues that we were talking about as a panel. Do you think that that preparation, or was that preparation, did that grease the wheels a bit or facilitate the ability for that budget to be passed?
I absolutely, I think so. And I think because we were having conversations about poverty, that were the same conversations that we were having as a panel. So our conversations, starting with the panel, sort of spread out to be a community-wide conversation. We had our community conversations with the groups that came to speak with us, and with the groups where we went as members of the panel to go listen. So I absolutely did it lay the groundwork and start the conversation. I think it really was a longer, slower burn, and it sort of came to fruition with the 4-year budget. And it was a perfect place to be when COVID hit. That recognition that if who's going to be hit hardest by this pandemic and all of the struggles that came with this pandemic, absolutely the most marginalized and vulnerable, we're going to feel it much harder than the rest of us.
Yeah. I think part of the difficulties that you always face is just for an average citizen who sits there and looks at these social predicaments that communities, this is true across the country, it's not just with London, but they fail to understand the nuance that goes on between the jurisdictional levels of government, like city or municipality, the province and the feds. So when you come to something big like this, health-related issues are really related to the province, right? Housing things can very much involve the province, but also the feds, who have a federal policy on that. And they also have budgets that can address those things. The problem for the municipality is that basically where you get your funds from, if you have to do anything, is really property taxes. That's about all you're able to do. And then you have to try to, woo the other levels of government to come and help you handle some of these problems. And I think people don't realize that. They're just wondering, this is a priority thing. Why aren't you doing more about housing? When we don't really have the capacity as a municipality to do all of that. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. But the thing with housing is, all that downloading and uploading that's gone on over the years. So the previous governments sort of restored the funding that had been taken away from previous governments. And so it's flow through money that comes through the municipality and is managed and granted in some aspects, budgeted in other ways. But there is we just had a presentation yesterday from the Center of Hope, Salvation Army, and from Mission Services, and also city staff, talking about the emergency shelter system in particular, and how the province and the city want to move towards that housing model. Like, let's prioritize the limited money that is available and try to make that shift from looking at a temporary place for somebody to sleep tonight versus a permanent place for that person where they can call home. And so it is a shift in mindset. It's a shift in how resources are allocated. And it does require additional investment, which isn't forthcoming right now from the province. We've been getting quick injections of a lot of cash for temporary COVID-related solutions, but having, say, the Center of Hope and their shelter, they're the biggest shelter, I think. Them and Mission Services have the 2 largest shelters in the city. So having them shift to this housing model would require them to have additional staff on site to coach people, to help them get what they need in order to make that transition into permanent housing. It might be ID, it might be mental health supports, whatever supports they need to make that transition. And so we recently went through an RFP process. The RFP was canceled because right now, those 2 large actors in particular, but the system in London, it was what the city was looking for was too big of a shift too quickly. So canceled the RFP process. identified a number of shelter providers, including those two big ones, but also Unity Project, my sister's place, YOU. And so working with them to slowly but gradually make that shift to a housing supportive model rather than just a temporary emergency shelter system.
Do you ever feel, Maureen, that like when I was in Parliament, it was in 2007. I was there for a number of years, but you know, I had just kind of got elected to there, and then we were hit by the Great Recession, right? And then everything was, the feds were going to release money to help to handle that emergency situation that was going on across the country. The feds would say, okay, these things have to be shovels in the ground, ready, you know, and completed by a certain period of time. And then during that time, all of these municipalities, even regions and others, came up to Ottawa to speak with the various ministers and others. So it was really still up to the federal government or the provincial government to decide which of all of those projects that people were looking for would be approved.
Right.
So that was one thing. And then the second thing was you had to do it in harmony with the provinces, who also had their own kind of agendas as to what they were doing with it. But I remember I would meet with a lot of these delegations in my role who came up to Ottawa to look for stuff. And they must, I wondered if they felt like distant cousins. You know, the way that federalism works is you got the feds and you got the provinces, and then you've got the municipalities. But the ones with the least amount of room to maneuver are municipalities. But it's in municipalities that the greatest problems are exacerbated. So do you ever feel like that sitting on council, that you see these problems and you know that they're huge and you really need senior partners to focus on that and get serious with it? But when, do you ever find that it's hard when you can't really answer it directly just by yourself as a municipality?
It's a challenging path to walk along. Hazel McCallion used to always say, the feds have all the money, the province has all the power, and the municipalities have all the problems.
And she was the mayor of Mississauga, right? When she said that.
Yeah. And so the challenge is navigating the whole party system, trying to advocate forcefully, firmly, and effectively without ticking anybody off. We often have resolutions that come to council as like, we need to send a strongly worded rebuke to this level of government for that reason. And so there are partisans that sit on council. I try to stay very nonpartisan because I always oppose those kinds of motions. Advocacy is to the other levels of government is absolutely one of our roles, and we should be doing that, and we should be doing it effectively. We should not be biting the hand that feed us, and we also shouldn't be yes people either. We have a responsibility to the people of London to speak forcefully on their behalf. We're lucky to have the two advocacy groups that we have, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which does the federal lobbying for all municipalities across the country, and we have AMO, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, the Ontario version of that. They're very effective. I know early on when the Ford government was elected, they immediately wanted to make a whole bunch of changes to public health and how public health is funded, the public health system, not the healthcare system where you and I might go see the doctor, but the public health system with the public health units. And they were, the funding formula was 75% covered by the province and 25% covered by the municipalities. And immediately they wanted, even retroactively. So they got elected in June. The following spring, summer, they said retroactive to January of that year, we want to change the funding formula to 70-30, which is a huge hit to the municipal budget.
Yeah, that's right.
Our local budget for the health unit is around $40 million right now. It's gone up because of COVID, but so changing that funding formula is huge. So there was a big outcry from municipalities about that, and it was direct advocacy through AMO that led the province to put a pause on that. Now they maintained that this is the funding formula, but since 2019 they have given the mitigation funding. So the municipalities have continued to pay 25%, and the province covers that difference, even though it's not technically the funding formula anymore. They're paying that. They're still paying the 75%. So that's the effectiveness of AMO. Also, the gas tax rebate was, yeah, that came from, I believe, through FCM. I believe Jack Layton was a city councillor at the time and played a key role in getting that kind of funding from the feds. We also get some of that from the province as well. And that's generally for transit related. The provincial portion of the GST or of the gas rebate goes directly to the LTC in London. So it goes directly to the operator of transit. Whereas the feds, it comes to the city. But that kind of advocacy is really important to do. Another thing that happened recently was here in London, our businesses paid more in the provincial education taxes than in Toronto. Like the formula was so that they paid a much higher percentage here. So one of my constituents is the Masonville Mall, and I had the management there for years saying, you got to do something about this. You got to convince the province to make this change. We'd been advocating for years to the province to make it equitable. And when COVID hit, we framed it as an economic recovery tool, that immediate relief that they could give to businesses in London by just making that rate equal. And they did. After years of, so the Wynne government started to make it, and they were gradually doing it. Then they hit pause, and they were like, until we balance the budget. Then there was an election, so it stayed at that pause, at that unequal level. And because of COVID, the provincial government made the change right away. So those kinds of things are wins for municipalities when they happen. It's just constant work.
So I know at the federal level, Maureen, that the way that they fund, there's a direct fund that comes that's a result of population in a municipality. Depending on how many are in the city, you kind of get that stuff automatically. But then there's a kind you compete for, right? Whether it's housing or whatever it is. And I do remember that when the groups came up to Ottawa from the various municipalities, some were really prepared. They had everybody almost from every sector agreeing on certain priorities. It might be that they felt that this year that research was really important, or it could be housing or whatever. There are others that weren't, that it was primarily just a couple. And in some cases, it was the mayor and the city administrator that came up and spoke to our various committees. I had to help shuffle them around. Do you think, and I'm just asking you to be honest, it's my sense sometimes that civil society here in London is sometimes not as helpful to council as it could be. There's a lot of competition that goes on, right? Lots of people that want funding for different things that are out there who don't really understand the constraints that the city administration is under, but also who maybe don't come together and coordinate as well as they could to help a city as it moves forward and tries to draw in other interested investors to do it. I know you've had some experience with this, I presume, but do you feel that that's part of the difficulty London is facing, is that civil society isn't quite as together as it should be?
There have been challenges, but again, it sort of comes in waves. Yeah. I would say the beginning of the conversations that we had at the council and even in the community about rapid transit. We had not decided yet on what the mode would be, whether it would be light rail or whether it would be a combination of rail and buses. And so I think in those early days, we were very in sync. And now she wants down. So we were very effective in our lobbying with, and London really has a great, now we're facing a huge wave of retirement, but we have a great civil service. We really do. So when they come, as you said, they come with these funding initiatives or these pots of money, and they'll say, you got to be shovel ready. And they'll say, your project has to begin no later than this date, and it has to be substantially finished by that date. Whenever they do those kinds of things, our staff generally have a list of projects ready to go. So they're constantly working. They know how it works. They constantly have things in the pipe ready to go. Whether it's going to come to council for just regular budget, they can, if they have those that they think this could go to council, or it could go to other levels of government as the funding becomes available. So they're always ready. And so we generally are very successful in those requests for funding. And BRT was one of those things. We worked very hard. And I would say from the council, the previous council, whenever there was an AMO or an FCM, I was on FCM for that during that first term of council. There's 5 meetings a year of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And many of those times you're talking directly to MPs and cabinet ministers. It was a full court press, staff, the mayor, and councillors just constantly talking about our proposed rapid transit project. Yep. And even with this term of council, I haven't found, and again, maybe it's COVID and the virtual environment, it's different styles of new councillors that have come in, definitely a different style for the mayor, much less of that Team London feeling than there was on the previous term of council. Of course, there was much more consensus too with the previous council. But that's part of our job, right? Is to the Trudeau government came for their that town hall meeting that they had at Alumni Hall in Western, and then they had their caucus meeting here in London. I was sitting at that town hall meeting beside Scott Bryson, and Champagne was near me, and the fella from out east, I can't remember his name, and Sohi was near me. Now, Sohi at the time was no longer Minister of Transportation or whatever he would have been, and I had already done a lot of lobbying with Sohi, but just running into these people, you always got to have your elevator pitch ready, right? And that's what our council was like, that 2014 to 2018 council. We all had an elevator pitch. You happen to run into somebody between meetings. Hey, remember me? We met and we talked about this, and we're really looking forward. We're waiting for it to hear back. That was my pitch near the end, was because we knew we had a commitment for money from both levels of government. And I would say things like, we're waiting for that agreement to be signed. As we're ready to go. As soon as you guys sign on the dotted line, we're ready to go. And it's part of the job.
Yeah. I'd like to talk to you more. Maybe we can do a second one of these if you don't mind. Maybe a string of them, because I think figuring out how council works is really important, because most of us don't know. We're not in there. And but I would, when I think of civil society as well, we can talk about this another time. It's also the agencies like the food bank or the United Way, or those type of groups that are in a community, how sometimes they're not as together as they could be, that would help a city council to make certain decisions. But maybe we can do that next time. But I did want to ask you something personal just as we conclude, if you don't mind. Is that okay?
I don't know. Okay.
No, I've known you now for a number of years. I got to know you from that mayor's panel piece. But whenever you and I meet and talk, it always ends up in poverty within about 30 seconds. And I think there, different people get into politics for different reasons. But I have sensed with you, Maureen, there's a real seriousness that you take about poverty related issues, also Indigenous issues, as they, poverty and all of those things. Where does that come from in you? Have you always been like that? Or is it something that you've learned more since you've been in council and it's really kind of captured you? Or is it both?
Yeah, I would say that, as is the case with a lot of Londoners, I was a mom, I had 3 kids. I was focused on my family and my neighborhood. I really wasn't like a Jesse Helmer or that really political animal that was constantly following what was going on in municipal government.
Yeah.
So because of issues in the neighborhood and wanting to be more involved that way, and seeing some of the issues that had grown on the council when Joe Fontana was mayor, that really inspired me to run. Yeah. And I would say that, and generally caring about my community and wanting to make a difference. I didn't really know what that meant when I was running, other than vaguely, right? So being asked to join the mayor's poverty panel, and I've learned since it was Lynn Livingston, who's now our city manager, that insisted that I be asked to join the mayor's poverty panel, because I was deputy mayor at the time. The other deputy mayor might have possibly had a conflict with some of the work or recommendations that could have come out of the panel based on his other employment. So my name was put forth. They asked me, and it really, really was a baptism by fire. I didn't feel, and I remember having a conversation with Lynn saying, what can I bring to this? I don't know anything about this.
And it's
I don't know.
It's complicated.
It's so complicated. And I felt very unqualified. And Lynn's response to me was, you are not a content expert, which I was not, and I didn't want to pretend that I was. She said, your role is to a number of things. Number one, to show that this is a serious thing. And so a member of council and a deputy mayor should be on this panel to show the seriousness with which the entire council was viewing the issue. And also to be that sort of liaison, almost advocacy role between the panel and city council, and to champion the final report to city council, which I did. Yes. I learned more in those 7 months, probably than like compared to everything I've learned in my term of city council. I would say it's comparable that in that 7 months, what I learned. Yeah. And this is when I first started also learning and talking about Indigenous issues and how poverty and homelessness and food insecurity and all those things hit Indigenous communities particularly hard because of all of the challenges that are lumped together in all of that. So it's it was we come to this, Glenn, always because I think it's a human thing. It's not just about how do I get this person that's sitting on the street corner a cup of coffee or a place to stay tonight. It's about how is everybody in our city able to be contribute to the community however they wish to, but to have the freedom to be a contributing member and not just an invisible person that when you walk past them, you avert your eyes. These are human beings and they're fellow Londoners. Yeah. And that's I represent all of Londoners, not just the ones who vote and not just the ones who live in Ward 5. Yeah,
that's right. Well, I will say that I guess seized is not too strong a word. I think you have been seized with this issue. And as someone who interacts with a number of different people in the community, I see in you a seriousness that you have brought to it, Maureen. And this stuff is really meaningful to a lot of us. And it's so helpful to have a counselor that, I know you have a lot of different issues that you have to cover, but you really seem to focus in on these issues that mean a lot to us and for which right now for the city, we're really confronted with a lot of social situations that we're having to address. I would like to circle back with you sooner rather than later, if you're okay with that, because I think the developing of an understanding how council looks at these things is important. But also I'd like to talk to you about, and I think you're the right person to do that, because of the mayor's panel when we were on it, we were having all of these different groups come and speak to us as a panel. Do you remember?
I do.
And I would be interested in your view is how better can we as community organizations, not just poverty ones, but groups say like a chamber or a Western University, other things like that. How better could we come together to help council as it moves forward with it, rather than all coming with our own particulars agendas to the word? Could we have that talk? Because I think right now, because of the pandemic, I think that's really an important thing, but it's also something I learned in my time in Ottawa, that those municipalities that did that and transcended their own sectors and were able to come together for the big issues. I think we could really use your help to understand as a council how you see that and how we could better help you. Would you be up for that?
I would absolutely be up. I'm up for anything with you, Glenn.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate all the work you've done, and I appreciate your laser focus on poverty, because these issues are now coming home to roost. They were there before the pandemic, but now they've really burst out and they're kind of confronting us all, and we as a community need to come together to do it. I appreciate how much
Absolutely.
you've helped us to do that, Maureen.
Oh, thanks, Glenn. And it's almost like the pandemic had these hidden blessings, not really blessings, but the pros and the cons. And I think keeping this issue front and center, and because everybody else went home and hunkered down and stayed behind closed doors and worked from home, and the only people that didn't and couldn't do that were people that didn't have a home to go to. And so that really kept the focus. Like, this problem has not gone away. We threw a little bit of money at it. It's still here, and it's still big, and it still needs all of our attention.
No, we appreciate all that you've done. I'll be in touch with you within 24 hours to see if we can book a second one of these, because I do think the community response to the leadership that council is trying to show is very, very important as well. And if we can all be on the same page, it's a real help. Thanks. Yep. I appreciate you doing this.
Thanks, Glenn.